Hello, listeners. This is Janine
and Kristen
from Henrico Casa. You are listening to our podcast, Vigilant Voices.
Living life every day.
Hello, listeners. We had our very first podcast guest, Abby Phillips, join us last month. We had such a great time chatting with her. It just really energized us, and we're excited to bring another guest on the show today.
And before we introduce our special guest, Kristen and I and our awesome team at Henrico Casa, we know that we are not the only vigilant voices speaking up on behalf of children's well-being in our community. And there are so many other strong voices speaking up for kids and families, and we want you to know them just like we do.
Our guest today is without a doubt a strong voice speaking up for children in the Richmond community. He's a licensed clinical social worker who has been focused on not only mental health concerns for children and teens, but also trauma and resilience education.
Yes, which is so important. And he is someone who knows about the challenges facing children and families and is helpful in ensuring no child continues to face abuse, neglect, or trauma. And after many years with Child Savers, he recently began a new role as the Senior Director of Community Outreach at St. Joseph's Villa. And so we are extremely excited to welcome John Richardson-Lauve. So John, thank you so much for being here.
Kristen, Janine, thank you very much for having me.
We are excited for this chat.
We are. We appreciate your voice in our community so much. Over the course of your career, you've created a platform where you are able to speak up for children, specifically children who have experienced trauma, or sometimes we say children from hard places. I'd love to know where this strong voice developed. What's your story? What brought you to this type of work?
Thanks for the question.
Okay, yeah, it's a long question, but there's just so much we want to know.
It is. So years ago, a few years ago, I went back to a high school reunion, and I've been about 30 years in the field, so plus 30, more than 30 to high school. And it was really interesting. I was walking around my high school hallways and kind of thought back and realized that back then I was a social worker, that even though I didn't know it, I was still doing social justice work and working for people on the margins and people who needed extra support. I've always gravitated towards working with children, that kind of vulnerable population. But I've done a lot of work in outpatient mental health. But I think where I got real traction and real love for the work was when my wife and I moved out to Omaha, Nebraska to work at Father Flanagan's Boys Town.
Oh, neat.
And we did that for 2 years, working with kids in the foster care system, and then moved here to Richmond for the next 6 years to work at the Virginia Home for Boys. And we were invited in to open up the first girls' house.
Wow, I'm sure that was an experience.
And for the next
I didn't
6
know
years,
that,
for the next 6 years, we lived with 8 teenage girls in foster care in our home.
Yeah.
And it was really, I don't know how to put it. It was real heart work. It was a job, but it wasn't a job.
Right.
It was a life. You don't, for those of us who have children, hopefully, we don't look at our kid when they need us in the middle of the night and think, I'm going back to work. We think, I'm going to love my kid. And that's the same thing. That was our attitude. And our son, who's now 16, was born and came home from the hospital with 8 big sisters, ready to go.
Yeah.
And I've always looked at work at my job as, and we all talk about work-life balance and work-life integration and things like that.
Right.
And I'm privileged to have job and work experience where I get to feel really fulfilled in doing what I do. But I've always seen that real need for integration, and I don't see them as significantly separate. One example of that is on my business card is my personal cell phone number. And I've always made a real point for that. I don't want a work phone. But working at St. Joseph's Villa now, being able to have impact. If I have a personal, word of the year or word of my life, it would be having impact. Being able to make change and see that change, for all of us who work with kids, getting to see that those seeds get cultivated over time, and being able to see that. And I love it when people who I trained from 5 years ago, hit me up and they say, we have a new initiative, and I knew exactly who to call. And it lets me know that what I did had meaning and had impact.
Your work is who you are. The personal passions and professional are all interconnected. I totally get that.
Yeah. And I think it does. It it is. I think it's why I'm still, at Casa for so many years. I think it does. It's just there's something there, and there's something that we know is so important, and so we're fighting that good fight.
Right.
So John, you have done so much work in our community, but also around Virginia and elsewhere as you travel and do a lot of outreach. So we talk a lot, and whether it's a buzzword or not, but the use of the word trauma. And we hear it a lot, and I think a lot of us know what it means, but do we? So what does trauma mean in this world and this work, and how do you take that out as you are teaching and educating others?
Yeah. I'm going to start by not answering your question.
That's fine. I thought that was a good question.
No, I'll get to it. The root of understanding trauma lies in our brains. And the magic is to understand how brains work, how brains develop. And that doesn't mean that we need PhDs in neuroscience. But to understand what happens for you and I sitting around this table. And we're in our logical thinking brain, and we're able to be rational and
Right.
think about consequences and develop relationships and make good social skills decisions and things like that.
Right.
And to understand what happens to a brain for an individual when they're in crisis, when they are under significant stress, which could be in the moment,
Right.
that you have a car accident, you are mugged on the street, assaulted, whatever that event might be, that your brain's going to go into a different gear, what we usually term the survival response, fight
Right.
or flight.
Yep.
And for instance, an officer on the street who's in a situation of someone's mental health crisis or situational crisis, it's incumbent upon that officer to understand that individual is going to need a different de-escalation tool
Right.
or a different way of interacting with them than an individual who is not in that crisis state. And then we take that and compound it through experiences of significant trauma in our lives, which have lasting impact over time and change the way that even when we're not in a situational crisis, that the brain is still going to act differently. So the typical example that we use is the kid who lives in an environment, whether that's in their household or in their community, whatever that ongoing life event is of trauma that happens in the home or in the community.
Right.
It makes sense for that kid to be scared when they're at home, which is very sad, but the reality of some kid's situation.
Right.
It makes sense for them to be scared at home when there is violence going on in their home. But it is important to realize for an educator to realize that when that kid comes to school, their brain's not able to change gears.
Right.
So that when they're back in school, their brain is not focused on the math lesson that's being taught, but focused on staying safe because they don't feel safe. And that kid's not going to learn math unless they feel safe. And it's hard for that brain to change gears. So trauma is what impacts that individual, whether child or adult, that has lasting impacts or echoes that where we're not able to feel safe, even when objectively we should be able to feel safe.
Right. No, thank you for that answer. We do a lot of trauma training and explanation, and it really is. I mean, it is about brain science, and I'm always fascinated by that as well. And our staff certainly works to understand that, but it is hard to make sure that then the other individuals who are working with children and families understand how deeply embedded it might be in somebody's system.
Right.
Right.
Because objectively, from that middle school teacher's perspective,
Right.
it's a get over it. I'm not your therapist.
Do your job, do your work, right?
Right. From the outside looking in, like they are in fact safe in that moment. At least that's our adult perspective.
Yeah.
I'm here to teach you,
Yes.
and you need to be a good learner, and I'm going to be a good teacher. And again, to go back to educators, experiences of trauma and life stress cause barriers to learning.
Right.
And that math teacher is not going to ever be the math teacher that kid needs unless we're able to address those issues going on with that kid first.
Yeah.
And John, I'm always fascinated by how trauma, one, impacts everyone differently, but two, truly changes a child's brain, like the structure, the chemistry. Can you explain that a bit for our listeners?
It goes back to that heightened stress response, survival response, that I'm always looking for threats, that my body has been programmed over time, potentially from an in utero experience, because cortisol crosses the placenta barrier. So a mother's stressful life is going to impact the child's in utero brain development. But if a child spends an individual, because this isn't just about kids, but if an individual spends a lot of time in significantly stressful experiences, whether that's, again, violence in the home, whether that's chronic bullying, whether that's community violence, then that brain is just not able to calm down. It's wired
Mhm.
up to prioritize safety. It's wired up to prioritize connections because I don't feel meaningful connections in the
Mhm.
world. And those things are prioritized above all of the normal acts of daily life that we prioritize in terms of learning, daily functioning, delayed gratification, thinking about consequences. All those kind of things are not nearly as much a priority for that brain that doesn't feel safe.
Mhm.
Yeah, their brains are hyper vigilant.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
John, what can parents, teachers, community members do to support children, or really anyone of any age who carries this trauma, either from a traumatic experience or, something more related to our work is the complex trauma that comes from compounding negative events?
One of the biggest things that we work with educators to help support them to do with children, the examples that we're giving here, is to help those kids regulate and to realize that we need to give them tools that kids are not born with the ability, individuals are not born with the ability to regulate their bodies. A newborn baby needs a mom or dad or caregiver to come and soothe it so that the child can go to sleep. They need to be rocked. They need to be patted. They need to
Mhm.
be sung to, those kind of things. And that is someone else co-regulating for that infant, for that newborn. And over time, building up that skill so that that infant can be able to uh, go to sleep on its own. But that is an acquired skill. And a lot of our kids in school age kids have never learned effective self regulation skills. The
Mhm.
ability to calm myself down, you and I, if we're in a stressful moment, we might take some deep breaths. But some kids have never had the experience of that, had been introduced to that concept, as
Right.
simple as stopping and taking deep breaths, um, of refocusing on something other than the guy I really want to hit. But to think
Mhm.
about something else and, focus on something will bring me positive energy in my life. Maybe I don't have the skill to be able to divert my attention, and because all I want to do is go and hit that person. And so that's what I end up doing. And then there are consequences for that. So school educators can understand how to help kids regulate. So some examples of that in an elementary school classroom, a lot of classrooms have what's called, it goes by a lot of different names, a cozy corner, a comfort corner, a
Mhm.
regulation
Right.
station, a resilience station. And it might be an area in the classroom where a kid can go and take a break. And
Which sounds so simple.
Yeah.
sounds so simple, but a
Reset.
traditional structured educational system, you don't get a break.
Right.
The break comes in an hour. Sit down and do your work. Um, it always brings me joy. I was just this past Monday, I was down in Southwest Virginia and had some educators, and this was Head Start, so this is
Mhm.
pre-K, and they were effectively teaching their kids, and they had a safety station in their classroom, I think is
Mhm.
what they called it, and kids could elect and request to go. And,
Mhm.
and I think they called it, I need to take a minute, I
Mhm.
think was kind of their key word for it. But kids were able to step out of the structure of the school day and go and spend some time back there. And that is such an important social emotional learning skill to
Mhm.
be able to build the skill of saying, I need to take a break.
Yeah, that's great. They're learning self awareness and self advocacy there.
Absolutely.
But in a traditional school day, I don't get to do that if I'm a student. I don't get to say I need to take a break unless I have
Mhm.
some pretty insightful educators in my classroom. So unfortunately, what does the student do when they need to take a break, but they can't ask to take a break? What are they asked to do? They raise their hand and ask to
Go to the bathroom
go to the bathroom.
Always.
or get a drink of water.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, think about how many times within a typical school day a bathroom trip is taken with no need for bladder and bowels.
Right.
That it's going to take a break from this kid sitting next to me that's annoying me. But I get to work with schools. I have worked with schools that really honor that need, and the ability for kids again to self-advocate,
Mhm.
and where they can take a break. Can I go take a lap?
Right.
Some schools, schools with circular hallways.
That's an even better break because it involves movement.
Movement is a bilateral movement is a inherently regulating kind of thing.
Mhm.
What do you do when you get really frustrated? You want to go take a walk.
Right.
But these kids can raise their hand and say, "Hey, can I go tag off at the front office?" And they'll walk down the hall, they'll come back and be able to do their work so much more effectively.
I love that.
Yeah. Thinking about the schools and educators who are implementing some of these ideas, are you or they seeing results?
Yes, the ones who are willing to. I worked with a lot of teachers and within schools where the teachers believe and will say very emphatically, these kids need to be yelled at. It's the only way that they listen.
Mhm.
It's doing the exact opposite of regulating, helping the kids regulate. Yet some people, just can't see that, and that's okay. It's not okay when it's hurting kids in the process.
Right.
So we work to advocate for those healthy environments and hopefully give those teachers the tools that they need to be able to work effectively with those kids and hopefully we can be in school systems where we empower the system to make sure that the right people are working with our kids.
Mhm. No, that's so important, especially, as kids are going back to school, settling back in right here. So in all of this, John, I hear a lot of conversation of what you do in terms of helping to educate the community, right? But it's not only the community, but it's individuals that are actually working directly with
Mhm.
children. And we had a special opportunity to have you come to our training of our advocates last year to try to help maybe solidify some of these concepts and put some tangible takeaways, to the concept. So I'd love for you if you could just take a few minutes and just kind of share what this brain structure, brain architecture game was that you had our advocates participate in, and just kind of tell our listeners like a little bit more about that, because I think it's such a fantastic exercise that people then don't forget because it's simulating something.
Sure. Well, if any of the listeners want to look it up, you can Google the brain architecture game, and
Can
you'll
we
find
link
it.
to that? Yeah.
Sure.
Awesome.
It's essentially a neuroscience arts and crafts project, working with
I love that.
straws, working with straws and pipe cleaners and some fishing weights and a die, and building a three-dimensional structure
Mhm.
to represent a brain. And the building materials that you get are based on a deck of special playing cards that
Mhm.
represent life events that may happen in a child's life each year, years 1 through 8.
Mhm.
And you might draw a positive life experience, life
Mhm.
event. And if you do that, then you get more building materials that are structured. So you would get a pipe cleaner and a
Uh-huh.
straw to put the pipe cleaner through, which creates a more rigid structure.
Mhm.
If you draw what's called a toxic stress or toxic life event card,
Mhm.
like malnutrition or abuse in the household or something like that,
Right.
then you end up with a pipe cleaner that you need to add to your structure to build, but you have no straw to give
Mhm.
it that rigidness.
Right.
And then there's this middle ground of tolerable stress, which could go either way.
Mhm.
And that's based on your life history of the events that have happened in your life.
Right.
So in year 4, if you draw a tolerable stress card, for instance, well, maybe not in year 4, maybe in year 6, you draw a card that says found drug paraphernalia on the playground.
Mhm.
That, if you've had positive experiences with your caregivers, if you feel like you can talk openly and honestly with your school staff,
Mhm.
if you have not been in an environment where drug paraphernalia is all too familiar,
Right.
then you might make a good choice.
Right.
And that ends up being a positive life event because I go and I talk to somebody about it and we, make a safe choice.
Right.
If I've had more toxic experiences in my life,
Mhm.
then I'm less likely to make a good choice and I might go over and play with that needle and end up poking myself.
Right.
And that ends up making that event go toxic.
Mhm.
So it really represents and illustrates the fact that we don't get reset buttons with our kids.
Right.
We don't get a clean start.
Mhm.
We don't get a clean slate. An individual's experience, whether it's for that 6-year-old or whether it's us at our older than 6-year-old ages,
Right.
um, that we don't get those reset buttons.
Right.
We will always be the sum of all of our stories. We don't have to have the worst moments in our lives define us.
Right.
And that has to do with a lot of empowerment and resilience work and things like that. But we don't ever get a clean slate.
Yeah.
And that's just the reality of it.
It is the reality. And I think the other thing too that our advocates ended up having some good conversations about was just remembering, and again, through this sort of simulated activity, it's about the cards that they're dealt to sometimes, and just literally what their family was like or is like and what they're currently experiencing. So I just think it was such a fantastically rich opportunity that I'm so glad that you brought to us, but that also that you're sharing out in the community, which is pretty fantastic. So
You're welcome. I got to play it this past Monday.
Did you? I wondered. Well, I wondered when you told some of the stories. I thought, I hope that may have involved the great brain architecture. So yeah, I'm looking forward to having a link to that in the podcast notes.
John, we have really enjoyed talking to you today. We valued our time with you last year during that advocate training session. And after that, we discovered the videos you made for Child Savers that break down trauma-related brain science. We loved them because they were just so easy to understand and they had little actionable tidbits. So listener, we'll definitely share those with you. But we can't wait to see what you do in this new role at St. Joseph's Villa. You're, without a doubt, a vigilant voice and doing so much on behalf of children. And we're trying to build a community of people through this podcast who also want to be standing up and speaking up for children. So John, tell us, what call to action would you leave with us?
One of the principles that we talk about when we talk about, which we haven't even talked about today, this concept of trauma-informed care, but understanding trauma and how it impacts individuals. One of the main principles that we talk about is responding to the need that's behind behavior rather than just reacting to behavior.
Right.
That doesn't mean that we make excuses for behavior or give free passes, but we have to understand what the need is behind that.
Which is easier said than done sometimes.
Exactly. If we have a child who's not behaving the way that we want them to, and has an empty belly and is really hungry because they haven't eaten since sometime yesterday, we can't bypass the fact that we need to feed them.
Right.
That they need food.
They're hungry. They're cranky.
School suspension is another great example of, every time I work with educators, I ask, raise your hand if you've known a kid who's been suspended from school. And then I ask, raise your hand if you know a kid who's been suspended from school and came back from that school suspension with better behavior. And almost every hand goes down.
So true.
I love asking that when the superintendent's in the room because usually the superintendent can't, honestly keep their hand up for that second question either. We still need consequences for behavior, and that's just part of being in our society. But if we don't respond to the need that's behind behavior, for instance, if a student in a classroom is in that scared state and doesn't feel safe within that classroom, we can't have punishments or any kind of consequences for that behavior and expect that behavior to get better without dealing with the need for how that kid can feel safe. We have to be able to have the insight to look to the next step, that I might be behaving the way that I am because I don't feel safe with kids sitting this close to me. I'm behaving in this way so that I do get put in the back of the classroom or get put out of the classroom.
Right.
A kid in their own home in a foster care situation might be behaving the way that they are specifically because they want to leave that home because they don't feel safe. And we have to focus on those needs. And that, we're talking about kids today and trauma today, but that has to do with, being a good manager in a workplace.
Right.
That has to do with just interpersonal interactions, that we have to look at the need behind behavior that's motivating behavior if we're going to have effective solutions.
I think that's a fantastic call to action because it's be purposeful in your interactions and then be thoughtful about your response,
Yeah.
And I love that because we never know, and we talk about this a lot, what someone is dealing with, what may be going on in their life right today or in their history. And I think that it's a good reminder to slow down and think why may that child or that person have that reaction, and just be thoughtful about then our response to that. So
Asking
I
the
love
simple
that.
question, what does this person need from me right
Yeah,
now?
I love that.
And then be ready to truly listen and respond.
Exactly. Well, could talk to you for forever.
Yeah, we may need you back for part 2 because there's so much more we could ask you about.
I know.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Vigilant Voices, Henrico Casa's new podcast. We have a vision for all children to live in safe, healthy homes. You can help us make that happen. Tell a friend about our podcast and find us on social media.
I believe in the better days.